Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors at Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and I have two guests joining me today. Dave, who's one of our pastors and a regular guest on the podcast, and Dr. Earl Waggoner. Thank you both for being here with me.
Thanks. It's an honor. Thank you.
Well, Dave, we are picking up a conversation that has been ongoing over the course of a few episodes now about the church and higher education. So can you bring us up to speed on what we've been discussing and where we're going to jump in today's conversation?
Sure. We've been talking about this phenomenon that we've observed over the past few years, that people in our church, and then sort of observing this more broadly, when the cultural shifts of the past several years happened, we observed that people weren't quite as rooted or formed in the faith as it had appeared. And actually, the shifts of culture kind of showed some formation and some rootedness to be not quite as formed and not quite as rooted as maybe individuals themselves thought initially, or certainly as we believed. And so this series of conversation is really us kind of going back upstream and looking at what are the major forces of formation in the church, in society, and what are those institutional forces and places of formation, and how are those institutions responding to the same sort of phenomenon that we've seen, these cultural forces. And so we're having to ask this question as a local church. What are we doing to shape and root Christians to be more stable in times of fluctuation, to have their faith more integrated and more completely sort of stable in their life, so that when times of testing come, they actually remain sort of in the faith and trusting in the gospel, and then we're also asking institutional leaders, what have they seen? Do they see the same kind of role of the institution as being formational or not? To what extent? How are they responding to the tools of formation in our institutions? Are they working or not to form students in a way that produces a kind of graduate that can withstand sort of kind of come what may in culture better than maybe what we've seen over the past few years? So it's sort of this wide-ranging conversation that we're having. And I was even thinking about this morning. I wonder if it comes down to this basic question, which is, do we believe that the people coming into our institutions, that they need equipping or transformation? Do the people who come into our institutions, do they need just assist? Like, hey, just give them some tools but basically they don't need fundamental changing? Or are they coming in and really what's sort of the responsibility of the institution, whether it's the church or the seminary or the university, is really for them to think, no, this is sort of a place where transformation needs to happen. And how we answer that question, I think, leads us to make certain decisions of how we lead these institutions. So that's kind of where we've been, and where we're going in this conversation.
As we're picking up these conversations with some institutional leaders, Dave had suggested a few folks who would be great to have on. It would be interesting to hear them speak from their perspective and their role as institutional leaders in our even from our local context. And so Dave had said, who would be great to have on is my friend, Dr. Waggoner. And we're so grateful that you could join us today. Would you tell us some about you, help us get to know you a little bit?
Sure. Thank you again for the opportunity. And I'll try to be as interesting as I can. Sometimes
wonderful.
Sometimes
wonderful.
that's a real chore. So anyway, I am currently the dean of the School of Biblical and Theological Studies in the College of Adult and Graduate Studies at Colorado Christian University. Pardon me. I've been in that position for 8.5 years. Prior to that, I was with Gateway Seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention for 13 years. 3 of those years, I was a campus director in the Los Angeles area. 10 years before that, I was a professor at Gateway's campus here in Denver, which when I was professor at that campus is when I met Dave. He taught for us for a while, some New Testament courses. 10 years prior to that, so let's see, 2002 is when I came on with Gateway. For 10 years prior to that, I was a pastor of several churches in South Louisiana, actually, just below the Bible Belt. And then for 10 years before that, I worked in media, television primarily. So some interesting vocational opportunities were provided me, and I've enjoyed the whole journey. Yeah.
Earl, I remember the first time we met. Your son Luke was a member of fellowship.
Yeah.
And I had just finished my PhD. And he said, "Hey, my dad is a professor at Gateway Seminary. You should talk with him." And so I did. We had coffee, and you ended up hiring me as adjunct faculty of New Testament for Gateway.
You did great work for us.
Well,
in Gateway.
It was a real joy.
Oh, good.
You took a risk on me.
It didn't seem like a risk, after we talked to you and, seeing what you had in terms of academic qualifications and credentials, it didn't seem like a risk at all.
Well,
we were right.
Well, I so appreciate that and how God used you to really help me at that point in sort of God's calling in my life. So I'm very grateful to you for taking that risk. I remember those early classes, beginning class, and having students wonder, where's the real professor? Because this fresh-faced, surely it's not that kid.
Not that guy.
Not that kid. Right. He can't be the professor. And very sadly, after a few years, no one had those comments anymore.
That's right. No longer a kid.
Age caught up pretty quick. Came at me fast. But anyway, thanks for taking that chance on me many years ago.
Again, you just did great work for us from day one. So thank you.
So, Earl, you went from working in the media to the pastorate,
right,
to working in higher education.
Right.
What precipitated that shift?
By the way, those are all things that are hated. People hate the media.
Right.
They hate sort of the church, and now they hate leaders of higher education. So,
right.
How does that feel?
I know nothing more. I know nothing other than being hated. So, whatever.
So well done.
Yeah. So, the media thing was something. I guess I was kind of a rarity because I went into college knowing exactly what I wanted to do and how I wanted to prepare. And I remember the summer before my freshman year, I took what used to be called I don't even know how they do it anymore, but the FCC required a third-class radio license to be able to do anything with an FCC licensed radio station. And I took the exam and got my license and showed up at college with my license in hand and had a meeting to be hired at the radio station even before my first day in class. So I knew that's what I wanted to do. So, kind of within the 4 years of college, Worked in radio, did some television stuff, and then my first job right out of college, I was blessed to get a television production job in Houston, and worked for a variety of production company and a regional sports network, Johnson Space Center. Worked at Christian Broadcasting Network for a while, and while I was at CBN, Christian Broadcasting Network, God just started working in my heart about the possibility of vocational ministry. And so, long story short, we committed to that, moved to New Orleans, Louisiana, started seminary. My wife and I had 3 kids, and yet to pay for seminary, I was working full-time at the ABC affiliate television station in New Orleans. So I stayed full-time in television while I was doing seminary work. And then after that, the Lord gave us the opportunity to pastor, going to pastorate full-time, and continue going to school. It's like, man, hadn't you had enough of this? And apparently not. Went back, got a terminal degree in systematic theology while I was in the pastorate, and then got the opportunity to move into theological higher education when we moved here to Denver.
What was that transition like from pastorate to then full-time academic ministry?
It wasn't hard for me, and part of the reason why is that even when I had committed to start seminary and just take this vocational shift, I was always interested in teaching. And even in the pastorate, that's where I felt like I probably was best gifted, was in teaching, preaching, maybe teaching more than preaching, if you want to make that distinction. So I was looking forward to the opportunity, and kind of my prayer at that time as a pastor was, Lord, I'll stay in the pastorate as long as you want me to be here. And every one of our churches that we pastored, I entered into those ministries with, Lord, if this is it for the rest of my life, great, thank you for the opportunity. But I would always kind of tack on but if you wouldn't mind, I wouldn't mind doing teaching, even at a seminary level, if that would be part of your will. And interestingly, one of the motivations for the teaching thing was the fact that I had come from another vocation into seminary, and I was 30 years old when we made the shift to ministry and going to seminary, and at that time that was kind of old for a seminary student. But I benefited greatly because of where I was in my life. I had never had any kind of educational stuff dealing with ministry at all. And so I benefited greatly from the seminary experience as an adult learner. I look back and I say, 30, was I an adult? And I think so. I was certainly older than most of my classmates. Mm-hmm. Most of the people I went to seminary with came right out of college and went directly into seminary, and they kind of looked at me even as a kind of an odd duck. The fact that I had been 10 years in another vocation prior to coming to seminary, So I benefited greatly from the seminary experience, and that was part of the fuel that helped me know I would really like to teach, to be able to help those types of students and adult learners, and really invest in people who are training for ministry, and particularly those folks who it may be a second career option too.
Mm-hmm. So you've now been in Christian higher ed for 23 years?
22, maybe.
22, yeah.
Close enough.
We'll throw in a bonus year.
20 plus.
Yeah. So, and your perspective is both as a teacher, as a professor, also as an administrator, as a leader, now as a dean. So the question is, and I want you just to now join us in this sort of broader conversation we're having. Give us your take on the state of Christian higher ed. what do you think is happening? What's the state? Give us the state of it, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, there are several aspects to answering that question. In one sense, Christian higher ed is healthy, and in another sense, it's struggling. All right, so both healthy and struggling are in response to the cultural shifts that you noted earlier. So it's healthy in the sense that a lot of believers are losing faith in public educational institutions and seeing the value of Christian higher ed, sending their 18-year-olds to a Christian school because of what they see as pretty radical shifts in cultural perspective, cultural values, the educational trajectories of public educational institutions. And interestingly, COVID kind of helped that, kind of fostered that. I know our undergrad traditional school at CCU benefited greatly from COVID because they weathered it well, and a lot of the reason why they did is they weren't having these, and I don't even remember what there was a word for it at the time, these mass COVID spread events that a lot of public institutions had, public colleges, when they'd have all these kids, massive parties, and everybody would get COVID, and that kind of life wasn't really going on at CCU. And so we were able to say, yeah, we're doing COVID well. We've got healthy students. We've got COVID cases, of course, but our student body is such that they're not falling prey to a lot of this cultural weirdness, and COVID provided a great case study to support that idea. So there's an increasing desire on the part of a lot of parents to say, yeah, I want to send my kids to Christian school. Now, where the challenges are maybe financial, because it costs a lot of money to send people to college, and that's no mystery to anybody, and that's no surprise to anybody. But some of the cultural trajectories that are underway now have Christian higher ed administrators wondering, are those cultural pressures going to be put on us so that we in good conscience can't provide federal funding and federal loans and government financial aid to our students, because a significant number of college students, Christian or non, the institution, benefit from student loans, government student loans. And there were a couple of cases maybe 5 or 6 years ago in the state of California where California was really clamping down on the admission requirements for Christian schools to be able to then qualify for public money. So, where the money goes, who's giving the money is kind of calling the shots. And so when federal funders were, or even state funders at that time, were saying, okay, if we're going to give you money, then here are the things you need to do in terms of what you teach and who you let into your school. And there was a bit of a panic with some Christian schools in California over, what is the government going to make us do if we want to keep getting their money? So that's, again, kind of a plus and minus in terms of where Christian higher ed is today. And just to kind of glom onto that, if I might, I'm in the College of Adult and Graduate Studies. So we are in a real growth curve because I again kind of look at the COVID thing too, but COVID opened people up forcibly to the realities of online education. And most of our delivery modality is online in our college. And the student population, the enrollment has more than doubled in our college in the 8.5 years that I've been at CCU.
Wow.
Again, we got a big bump because when people realized that online when they were forced into it because of COVID, they realized, well, this is good. This works for me. It's better than I thought it was. And if it's delivered well, then an online education is a good thing. Good thing. And a lot of our adult learners like the online model just because of it enables them to do work, to do life, to do family, and to kind of customize the educational structure to what they have going on in life.
You mentioned a couple of things there in that explanation that are picking up on themes that we've discussed over the past few weeks. One of those is a tension point that Dave had identified on a prior episode, and that being just responding to the current cultural shifts. So, and that can look a number of ways. You mentioned it in terms of responding to the shifts during COVID in regard to online learning. And that was a particular shift and a pressure brought about both by rapid technological advances and then by the context during COVID and the response to COVID. And then another that you mentioned, another of the tension points that it seems that a lot of Christian universities just have to respond to right now are how are we going to respond to certain ideologies and then the policies that are attached to those that may actually bring us into a confrontation with the government, with funding models, with certain policy requirements for our institution, and then how is that going to affect us and our ability to carry on. So it's interesting that, David, it sounds like Dr. Waggoner is agreeing with you that these are real tensions right now in the world of higher ed. So it's interesting to hear you process that. And I wonder, too, as far as CCU specifically, what is CCU's, either in their, if it's specific to their undergraduate program or the College of Adult and Graduate Studies or both, what does CCU say is its purpose or mission?
Great question. And I can tell you at the sign-off on the bottom of every CCU email, when we sign our names, it says Christ-centered higher education, transforming students to impact the world with grace and truth. So that sums up really well what we're trying to do. That's more than just a good tagline, but it is a focus of what we're trying to do at both the undergrad and the adult and grad level. I applaud CCU for being very intentional in, to answer Dave's earlier question, is it equipping or is it transforming?
Yeah.
And CCU is extremely intentional about doing both. Again, on the adult and graduate studies side, we work really hard at integrating faith and learning, looking at what that means. I remember when when I first started at CCU, a lot of times, integrating faith and learning looked like, well, if we just have a Bible verse at the beginning of each weekly session, isn't that enough? And so, and it's a challenge. If it's an accounting course, what's the Bible verse going to be? Something from Numbers? Is that what we mean by integrating faith and learning? And if we just put that Bible verse at the kind of the masthead of each weekly session, aren't we integrating faith and learning? And we realized, no. Bible verse is good and it needs to be there, and it still is there. But we've worked really hard since to make sure that assignments bring in a faith perspective. Again, whether it's an accounting course, certainly in the biblical and theological studies area where I am, that's a given. You're going to be doing that. But regardless of the discipline, regardless of the course content, how can we integrate faith with that learning? And how can we challenge our students to apply their learning in, through a Christian lens? Again, to go back to an accounting example, How does an accountant do her work Christianly? How does an accountant process spreadsheets and data in a faithful, truthful, Christian way with integrity? You know, and obviously there's not always going to be a Bible verse that answers that, but biblical principles of integrity and truthfulness and relationship and human value permeate all of those courses, whether they're explicitly Christian or not. So we're working really hard to make sure, and even on the undergrad side as well, that we truly are integrating faith and learning.
And that hopefully is working towards the prospect of actually being transformative.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so we're equipping well, and I think transforming, or at least providing the tools for students to experience spiritual formation, spiritual transformation. And it's interesting too, because at least, again, College of Adult and Graduate Studies, we do not require our students to sign a statement of faith when they enroll at CCU. So it's not a given that every student in your class is going to be a Christian, much less even open to an evangelical worldview. I mean, we don't pull any punches. We say this is who we are, and an evangelical worldview, a biblical worldview, informs everything we teach and everything we do. You don't have to buy that, but you're going to get it one way or the other. So, we'll have students from all sorts of faith or non-faith perspectives, and in some cases, we've had non-Christian students who go through a CCU program and come out Christian on the other end. They've made a faith commitment to Christ in the midst of their schoolwork, and being introduced to an evangelical worldview results in them understanding, this is something I want. I like this, and they become believers. As well as get a college degree.
I love how you describe the integration between faith and learning. And I love how CCU is doing that. I'm also interested in the integration of two other things, which is learning and life. And so I hear with the curriculum that you've thought through very carefully, how does whatever it is that we're studying actually interact with the Christian worldview and give a perspective. So when you leave here, you're actually going to be able to do your profession in a way that's in alignment with Christ and His church.
Yeah, right.
The other point of integration is the process of learning that includes integration of faith and learning with the regular rhythms of each individual student doing life throughout the week.
Right.
And so this now brings into question the sort of question of online versus in person.
Right.
And with your College of Adult Studies, like the assumption is these are people who are already in a profession. They're already kind of have a regular, they have a family they're raising. And so the idea of sort of plucking them out of that regular rhythm and sticking them into a classic, what we would think like a classic undergrad setting where they live at a place, but it's very embodied, just that isn't an expectation that you would have for that stage of life. With all of that said, though, there is, I think we're just sort of wanting to allow the tension, though, of what is when these students who during COVID realized, hey, the online model works for me, and there are better and worse sort of experiences of online education.
Sure. Right.
And you guys have worked really hard to make it excellent. And conversely, there are plenty of in-person educational experiences that are crap.
Yeah.
That just being in person doesn't mean that it's going to be transformative
That's
either.
right. That's right.
So that's not a magic bullet. Yet, do you sense some? What are you giving up, though? And that's a leading question. Do you feel like there is a sacrifice, or you're giving up something just by going online with that model? I know you gain. It makes sense that you would gain a lot. But what is given up, or how have you sort of accommodated for the lack of in-person engagement? I'm just curious if you like. I would love for you to talk to us about that.
Sure. The biggest challenge with online learning has always been the creation of community. That continues to be the biggest challenge. And a lot of that has to do with the perception long held that education can only be delivered and accepted if you're in the same room with all of your colleagues, with the professor, with the teacher, with your fellow students. And that's been a tried and true model for literally thousands of years. Right? I mean, you go back to, how did Jesus teach? Obviously there weren't long distance modalities at that point, but a big component of how he taught was the lived experience and, casual conversations with his disciples and with people, and they'd show up and they'd eat together, and there was a deep sense of community, and that facilitated what Jesus communicated. So that is a tried and true model. And so I think online education, particularly in the last maybe 15 years, has come to a good place in the creation of online community. And maybe I should compress that a little bit and say maybe within the last 10 years, it's come to a good place. And a lot of that is due to the shifting perception of new adults, so to speak, who value an online community at the same level as they value the neighborhood, as they value hanging out with people in a coffee shop or whatever. It's like, well, sure, you think about the gaming community, which, just millions of people, and their online community is as valuable, and in some cases more valuable, than their face-to-face community. Mm-hmm. So there's a shifting perception of what makes good community. Plus, there are the technological realities that you can get pretty close to a face-to-face community through technology. One of my big regrets of the last 5 years is that I didn't buy stock in Zoom. And everybody. People Zoom so often. Now you're talking about Zoom fatigue and everything, but you can just dial up somebody and they're accessible immediately, and you can see them on their screen, and you can talk to them, and you can see facial expressions, and so there's the Zoom connection thing that again COVID enhanced, and when you approach online learning in a way that maximizes the online delivery, then you, again, come really, really close to making it as good of an experience as a face-to-face experience. So what I mean by that is a lot of schools, when they got into online, maybe 15, 20, 25 years ago even, they did it because they were being forced to. And so it's like, oh, okay, we got to do this online thing because it's growing and everybody wants this. So all right, well, so begrudgingly, they would record 2-hour-long lectures, put them on the internet, and say, here's your online class. And that just didn't work. And people endured that because they had to, for whatever their reasons were. And so it became pretty apparent that, well, if we're going to do online well, we've got to think about this totally differently. And we've got to maximize online technology. So it's not going to be about a lecture. We'll upload videos, but they probably can't be any longer than about 10 or 15 minutes, because students who learn well online do so by not just sitting there and watching a 2-hour-long thing. And they can endure about a 10-minute thing, about a 15-minute thing, but after that, send them back online to make them do research, to make them have discussion environments with their colleagues, with their co-learners, read, do papers, do everything other than a lecture-based learning experience. And when schools figured that out, then they started to succeed with online learning.
Thank you for that description.
Yeah.
What are the metrics you use to determine whether or not a class worked? Like, this is a part of a question that I'm having, like,
yeah.
And even a part of sort of the tension of observing whether or not people have been formed during these cultural shifts.
Right.
And then, like, is what we're doing working, to shape people. So what metrics are you using to determine whether or not the listening to a lecture for 2 hours is worse than this more kind of integrated, a lot of these different sort of components for an online class that is now? Like, how was that determined, other than just better technology and who wants to look at a screen for 2 hours straight?
Sure. So interestingly, it's the same two sets of metrics that in-seat classes use. So the first one is really good, well-developed post-class surveys by students. So you got to ask the right questions. Did this work for you? Do you believe you were spiritually formed? What were some spiritual experiences that you had as a result of this? Do you feel like you grasped the material? Do you feel like you can take what you learned in class and now apply it in your job or your eventual vocation, whatever it may be? Did the instructor lead you well? Was the instructor all? Yeah, I mean, the same basic questions that you would ask a 19-year-old who's sitting in class all day and went through an entire semester. Did it work for you? How was the same basic questions? And then you craft good questions that bring out pluses and minuses with the online delivery. So you pull from that data, create a database there, and over time you're able to make comparisons and see trends, and so well-crafted post-course surveys. That's one data set. The other data set is alumni experiences. So they graduate from your online program, and you reach out and you say, "So, how's your accounting job?" I keep picking on accountants. I don't know. That seems
we have
to
plenty
work.
of those in the church.
Right. So you ask, did this prepare you to be a good accountant? Did you get the job you wanted because of your CCU degree that was fully online? And you compile that data, and you get a flood of responses that say, absolutely, it was a great experience. With your CCU degree, were you able to be accepted into graduate programs for you? Again, the same type of alumni questions that traditional delivery schools will ask, and then you respond to the data, respond to the trends that you see among alumni, and thankfully you get good responses that say, well, if we could have done that, that may have been a little bit more helpful. All right, we'll pay attention to that and make changes as necessary.
Good, thank you for that.
I wonder, too, if there's a distinction that could be drawn between the type of student or the age of the student as being the particular audience pool, if you will, who could benefit most from the particular sort of model or modality that you're talking about. If I consider, just draw a comparison point between my 17-year-old who's getting ready to head into college. She's a junior this year, and so we're thinking about college. And then myself, if I were thinking about her, my daughter, headed into college, she doesn't have some of the learner behaviors that I hope would be developed during those college years. And while I think that she could gain excellent information and probably even some of those skills via a good online learning model, there are some things that in her life I would hope she would develop or be formed in if she were in a more immersive college or university experience.
Sure.
And so it's not one or the other, but there are things that are gained or lost. Whereas if I contemplate myself heading back to school to work on a graduate degree, then my life experience, my discipline as an adult in this stage of my life, and my determination about why I'm going back and what it is that I'm working toward are probably quite different.
Yes.
So do you deal with some of that too in the particular programs that you oversee in the College of Graduate and Adult Studies?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and I mean, you're right there with your daughter. You know who she is, where she is, what she needs to learn well, and in most cases, probably that immersive experience is extremely beneficial, not just because of the content delivered, but the college experience. And I find that very interesting because the college experience as such is really only about 100 years old. So, prior to the early 20th century, well, first of all, it was typically only males going to college. They didn't have sports. They didn't have student union. They didn't have, it was just, you go there, you live on campus because you got to be studying all the time. You're in class all the time, but you don't have all of these perks that create a well-rounded immersive experience. So it's a relatively new thing in higher education, the whole immersive thing, but it is there for a reason, and that's because it works. And so your 17-year-old, when she graduates at 18, she's gonna move into the dorm probably. She's gonna, she's gonna live with her co-learners, and that's gonna facilitate the learning experience for her. So interestingly, on kind of the other end of that spectrum, an adult, so to speak, an older adult who goes and is open to an online program for a grad degree or whatever. It's interesting that our student population doing the online thing at CCU, that the low age number has steadily gone down over the past 7 or 8 years. So again, when I showed up at CCU 8.5 years ago, the youngest students that we would have were probably in their early 30s. But we've got an increasing number of students in their mid to late 20s now. And I think that speaks to that age group's greater openness to an online delivery system, and being satisfied with the learning that they receive, there. And a lot of people that age are, and this is probably a broad brush, and there'll be a host of sociologists who listen to your program who say, no, that's probably not right. But my point is, maybe a higher degree of maturity to mid and later 20s individuals, so that they can make the online environment work. They are highly motivated. They're there to learn. They're not there for a college experience. They don't care about that anymore. They want to learn. I'm going to go to school. I got a job already. I want to advance in my career, so I need a degree so I can get a promotion, or I want to change careers to do something that I've always wanted to do. I'm not able to do it now because of whatever reason, but I need that college degree. to progress in my vocational life. And so that's all I want. Just give me the stuff. You know, I don't need to have a student union. I don't need to have a cafeteria where I eat with everybody. I just want the stuff. So they're highly motivated. And most of our adult and graduate studies students are indeed extremely motivated. And another component is they're paying for it. Mom and dad aren't paying for it because, you know, I mean, you know, I can't speak for everybody, but I remember, you know, you go to traditional college at 18 and mom and dad want you to be there, and it's almost an extension of high school. And they're paying the bills, and, you know, the sense of responsibility is not nearly as great. And so that sense of responsibility is inbred by the time you're late 20s, early 30s. And I'm paying for this, and I want the most bang for my buck. So give me the stuff. Let me do the learning, and so I can move on.
Just a quick follow-up with that. I appreciate sort of the observation that these adults, sort of ed students, are getting younger and younger, and that you anticipated sociologists pushing back on that maturity bit. But I appreciate you saying the motivation there, and so I think that's really helpful and illuminating to hear your perspective on that. It still, though, to me, has I feel a tension, though, with it's still a model that's accommodating to the life of a student. Now, I obviously recognize the need for that. The tension, though, I feel is that I'm wondering if more and more we're kind of losing ground on the formational needs of students because we've accommodated to them. Meaning, I'm going to create a curriculum around sort of the realities of your life. Now, there's a reality to, like, I get that. And doing the best you can with that is sort of the task at hand. I suppose I'm sensing a more broader issue, though, and I don't know exactly what to do about it, which is it more true now that what students, certainly college-age students, but I would even say more even these older adults, in order for that formation to happen at a deeper level, maybe requires a more disruptive experience that doesn't accommodate to the normative structures of their life as an adult. And I suppose here's sort of a weird thing that I have rolling around the back of my head that sort of gives me this perspective. I don't know if it's legitimate or not, but this is what I was thinking about when you were talking, which is during COVID, we, as a church, we had to go online temporarily. And actually for a while, it wasn't that bad. Got constant feedback on, hey, we had sort of communion as a family in our living room, and then we began to go back in person more, and there was a certain group of people who just preferred online. Still do.
Right.
I just want to say I don't think that's good for them. Pastorally, I just observed that there is something that's lacking, that's necessary. Now, at the same time, there can be a grace in all these technologies that can give a church experience to someone who can't physically make it to church. And there's something that can be really beautiful there, or they're overseas, or there's something that prevents them. And so I don't want to do a broad brush with this, but I'm just saying, for the most part, this is actually the definition of broad brush. For the most part, I don't think it has the same formative experience. And now, sort of taking it, sort of a really macro level, at a point where there are all kinds in our cultural dramatic, formative sort of tools available for our culture to shape what people believe and think. And it just seems to me, I feel a caution of accommodating to those same non-in-person sort of impulses right at the point where I think people need that deeper formation the most. So those are some of the tensions that I'm feeling with it. Understanding the necessity of online education, and how, Autumn, I love your experience. Like, if you were going to pursue a graduate degree right now, I sure hope you wouldn't move. I would be very terrible for Fellowship Denver.
You would
Church.
say there are surely models that will accommodate to you
No,
just staying
so on a selfish personal level, I want that accommodation for you, because I don't want that disruption that out of the other side of my mouth I'm asking for. I don't want that disruption in my life and in my personal community. I also just want to recognize that in our cultural state at the moment, there is still this deeper need.
Right.
Like, are we doing the job of forming people at the level so that I love the alumni questions, like 10, 15, 20 years down the road, these ministers or accountants or whoever, they're still doing their vocation in a way that's faithful to the gospel, and it's in sort of concert with orthodoxy. So
What if we frame the question then this way, and you can tell me if this is a fair characterization of what you're saying, Dave, but you're asking, what are the necessary components of a formative or transformative education? And we've talked about some of those, the integration of faith, and then you talked about the integration of life. But is that a fair way to ask that question? What actually makes an educational experience, not only in content, but in the greater value that you derive from it, formational or transformational?
That's a good question. And both the phrased question as well as what you were talking about, Dave, in terms of the desire for spiritual formation and formational experiences. So the first thing I would say is I hear exactly what you're talking about in terms of the church and the COVID, can we call it experiment of online church? And I agree down the line with not only what you experienced, but your reflection on that and how well, let me just say it this way, without restating everything you said. Let me just say, first of all, that the formational value in an education is different than the formational value at church. So we're not even trying to compete as a Christian educational institution. We're not trying to compete with the church for spiritual formation value. We're not saying, oh, you can get all your spiritual formation needs met at CCU. You don't have to worry about church.
Because we want the students to come to church.
That's right.
That's right.
Oh, no, that's exactly right. And so part of the formational experience at a Christian school is to elevate the value of church and to recognize that only in the community of faith does that deep and thorough formation really happen. And we'll give you some tools, and we'll give you a little foretaste of it here at CCU in your Christian faith learning integrative classes, but you need a lot more than that for your spiritual formation. So there's an inherent limitation to the spiritual formation value even at a Christian school. And we're not trying to duplicate the church or compete with it, like I said. So that's an important thing to realize. And so Therefore, we can call ourselves successful at a Christian school if we just introduce students to formational experiences and introduce them to the realities of spiritual disciplines and what you can gain there, and then kind of gently push them toward their churches, their respective churches, and say, you can go a whole lot deeper at church. And so then it goes back to then the value you were talking about, Dave, how, for most people, you got to be in person for this, And so the pressure of, well, this online thing isn't in person, and so how much spiritual formation can really happen? That pressure is intentionally not that acute. Because, again, I'm repeating myself, but we're not trying to compete with the church in terms of spiritually forming our students.
And to the programs that you oversee specifically, would you say that they're doing that? They're doing what you hope that they would, and obviously you measure that via feedback.
Right.
So what are you seeing through these programs at CCU?
Well, again, my programs are a little bit unique in terms of the question you're asking, because ostensibly we're training people to go into vocational ministry in the church. So you get a grad degree in theology, you're probably going to use that in a church setting, and you're probably here to get that degree because you want to be in a church setting. You want to be a church leader. Same with a biblical studies MA, or even undergrad biblical and theological studies degrees that we offer. You're preparing for church ministry. So that's a population that's going to be really high on the chart of saying, oh yeah, church, that's where we need to be, and that's where the formation is going to happen, and I'm going to lead my congregation to do that very thing. So my programs, church is the deal. That's the goal. That's the place. But your question brings up an interesting question in my head, and that is, when we're surveying our alumni I'm going to pick on them again, in the accounting degree, I'm not sure that there's a question in that survey that says, how involved are you in your local church? How are you currently being spiritually formed? At that point, and I think this will make sense without it sounding callous, at that point, CCU doesn't really care about those things. I mean, they do. Of course, they want people to grow in their faith while they're at CCU, and we're responsible for helping to foster that. But once you graduate from CCU, things like spiritual formation and church involvement and Christian vitality, they're not as important data points as they were when you were a student here. So I'm not sure that they're asking alumni those questions. The hope is that they are. They're vital in their spiritual relationship. They're vital in their church involvement, and they're helping to make disciples for Jesus in not only the way they do their work, but the way they're living their lives.
I do think there's something unique that an institution of higher education has to grapple with, and that is, as an institution of education, you establish legitimacy, as you're saying, by equipping people for certain jobs.
Right.
But as a Christian institution, there is a unique sort of legitimacy as well in organizationally withstanding these cultural pressures. So that speaks to the perspective of administration, who you might choose to hire, certain ways that you would go about navigating the cultural currents and remaining rooted in biblical principles as an institution. And I do wonder, though, I think the wonder for me in it is then via the mission statement that we talked about earlier that you read that CCU has, and to Dave's musings earlier about how both churches and Christian institutions are doing in terms of developing people who are really rooted. There's a type of legitimacy that an institution of higher education establishes through the way that its graduates carry on their legacy as Christians as well.
Right.
So it carries a vocational component, being a good worker, being educated and equipped well to carry out a certain job. And then there is a sort of equipping that I think Christian institutions hopefully are doing alongside that gives people a sense of the value of going about their vocations in a way that does reflect a deeper biblical value and perspective on the world. And so I suppose that you have to be very concerned about both. And there are certain, as you're saying, degree programs that have to that integrate it in a unique way, because the purpose is to send out graduates who are going to be ministerial leaders.
Right.
And so there's a bit of a divergence there, perhaps, in some of the programs.
Yeah, and I would even add a third domain of equipping also, and that is, and there's a kind of an ongoing debate in higher education at large between those who say we exist as institutions to prepare people for vocation, and we're also teaching people how to think and how to think well and how to be intellectually prepared to lead a good, rich life. And you could even say we're training people to be lifelong learners. So that's another element, because it's more than just vocational training. And that's important, of course, but we're just trying to teach people how to think well. And that's also something that CCU takes very seriously. There's some Christian educational institutions, and this is not to discredit them, but their focus is teaching Christians how to be good Christians. And so how to handle the Word of God well, and how to apply Scripture to issues of life. But that's it. And again, that's not a bad thing, but the whole being a thoughtful, reflective person in society is not part of their goal. So we're not that, is my point. And so we're, of course, we want to help in spiritual formation. We want to train them well for their jobs, but we also want to give them good tools and introduce them to, it's the liberal arts education, and CCU takes that very seriously. Also, we read the classics, and we engage the classics with modern life. Modern. So that dates me right there. We engage the classics with contemporary life. How about that? So that's another thing that I think a Christian higher education institution needs to do well.
To form people into thoughtful civic participants.
That's right. Good citizens.
Yeah.
And again, I'm flying the flag here, but CCU is very intentional about doing the citizenship piece too. We operate off of some strategic priorities that a past president who was a big political name here in the state of Colorado, Bill Armstrong, longtime senator, congressman, successful businessman, he established these ideas, and he was very, very focused on not being biblically faithful in what we do, but also about how you approach being a good citizen, to be active politically and what it means to be active politically and from a conservative perspective, and a faithful citizen as well as a faithful believer. And we still operate under those, and without shame and without apology. And so, again, we're talking about just educating the whole person. And I think that's important as well.
Definitely. And we've talked about the value of classic liberal arts education, and I like how you've described that. As we wrap up here, though, I do want to bring up accountants again.
Okay, good.
Because I'm concerned about those accountants who graduated from your program 10 years ago and aren't being asked, how are you doing in your faith? I get and I appreciate your description of, like, there's obvious limitations of the responsibility that your department and your college has for that sort of hypothetical accountant.
Sure, right.
10 years. But what sparked this series of conversation in the first place was that hypothetical accountant, those are people in our church.
Right.
And those are the people who we see struggling. That then makes us ask the question, what's their formation like? And so to kind of sort of maybe bring an arc to this, I resonate with, and in previous episodes, we've talked about the value of the very thing you're describing with liberal arts education and educating the whole person and the need for transformation. And I think the question, though, that our current sort of reality forces us to ask is how that accountant was formed. Are there differences in longevity of that kind of formation? And that's I suppose one of the threads through this conversation. But I really appreciate how you've described and really educated me. Autumn probably already knew this, but I needed education on sort of the online experience and some of the philosophy behind that. It's been very helpful and illuminating.
Good.
And I appreciate you for introducing me to Christian higher ed on the teaching side many years ago, and really appreciate you being on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the thoughtfulness that resulted in this episode and the really good questions that you've asked, and how you apply conversations like this to your own ministry here at Fellowship, and the fact that you're concerned about those accountants, whether they graduate from CCU or CSU, and they're in your church, and how concerned you are about forming them spiritually, because it's not a closed-ended process. You don't take a course in spiritual formation, which I teach. You don't take a course in spiritual formation and say, all right, I got all my formation goodies, and I've checked all the boxes. It's
if
ongoing.
your class is doing that, we're going to send people to take your
That's
class.
Right.
Okay. Fair enough. But it's the sanctification process that the Holy Spirit undertakes, right? Conforming us to the image of Christ. And that is at the heart of that formational process, and I applaud Fellowship Denver for taking that seriously.
Dr. Waggoner, thank you for your work and your leadership and your example, and for spending some time with us today. For those of you listening, if you have questions, whether about today's episode or any of our prior episodes, or you have something you're kicking around in your own mind and want to hear us discuss it in a future episode of the podcast, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.